Ghost and Me podcast.
Welcome back to the second episode of the Ghost and Me podcast. Cody, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Bob. How are you doing, my man?
I'm doing well. Really excited. The first episode has been reviewed very highly, which was great to hear. Alan Greenfield's an absolute treasure. So any chance that we get to sit down and speak with him, we're going to take it every time.
100%. It was my first time actually meeting and talking to Alan, and he was great, man. A wealth of information and just all around a lovable guy.
No, absolutely. And I kind of touched on it in the podcast a little bit, but he has been like a shining star for me getting this second wind in life, I guess. Because we kind of went into it a little bit on the show, but before this, I was very career oriented, had no idea how to be a content creator. This is pre-YouTube, pre-everything. And, my YouTube career got started because of a payphone. So my Tales from the Dark fans are very well aware of that origin story. But on this side, it's pretty exciting to sit down and have this podcast with you. I know we had a lot of your fans come over on the YouTube, which we do have a YouTube channel now. And the easiest way to find that's probably to go to Mystery Archives over on YouTube, check the community post, and you'll find the link directly through there. Because Cody, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have to have a handful more subscribers before we have our own URL. Is that right?
No, so actually they changed it up where the URL it should be at the Ghost and Me podcast on YouTube. I did notice that if you search it in the search bar, it does pop up. So I'm hoping that it stays that way. I'm sure a few more subscribers wouldn't hurt. But I mean, hey, as of one day, I mean, we got over 100 subscribers, which is pretty incredible.
No, absolutely. Your fans have been great. Now, I've really enjoyed reading and hearing the response so far to that first episode. I think we have something special here, and we just have to keep going. And with that being said, this episode is kind of going to be a bit of a strange one. I know you have quite a few strange encounters in the woods, and so do I. And the ones I want to dive in today, kind of, they really do test the span of paranormal reality. So if you're good, I want to jump right into this one.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I do actually, and some of my subscribers may be vaguely familiar with this. I don't know if I've actually ever delved into the story itself, but I have my own dogman encounter from way back in the day. What I've come to believe was a dogman or something of the sort. So I may just be sharing that in this episode as well.
That sounds amazing. I love dogman stories. I don't live too far from Land Between the Lakes, where there's a very famous dogman encounter, consistent dogman encounters over the years. So can't wait to hear that.
Yeah, you're in like prime dogman territory, my friend.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so throughout all of human history, the forests of our world have always had a special allure. The trees have birthed countless legends and myths, as well as spawned all manner of forest entities, sprites, and spirits. Just walking amongst the tranquil woods, one can feel why this might be so, as it is a place that holds an almost mystical quality to it. Sometimes even seeming like a place where we don't belong in at all. So Cody, let me ask you, have you ever been in a location, like there's a few different woods I've been in, especially out in the Rocky Mountains and in deep Appalachia, that I'm just like, I don't think I should be here. It doesn't seem like a person should be here. We feel unwelcome by just the elements, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I've definitely been in a few different places that have felt that way, with the most notable, I think, being down there in Appalachia, particularly one of the last times, if not the last time we were there. I mean, I'm sure if you recall, it was pretty spooky when we went to look at, I believe it was Strawberry Cave. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were looking at Strawberry Cave, and I remember we came back. And we had seen it a little bit during the day, but we were like, oh, let's come back a little later. And we come back, and I remember getting out of the car, and everything just seemed to go quiet. I mean, there was like a pack of coyotes like howling in the distance, and then they even went quiet. And then there was that weird like chanting sound that came from over in the trees that kind of, I don't know how else to describe it. It like encircled us. And that, I remember we don't usually stray away from stuff like that, especially now that, even though I'm a little newer to the in-field investigational aspect of it, compared to maybe perhaps how I was even like a year ago. But I know that we were both pretty freaked out, and we were like, I think we need to get out of here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Before we end the episode, I'll dive into a story about those woods in general and how I accidentally almost burned them down once.
You know, I vaguely heard you mention it, but I don't think we've actually gotten full board into the details. So I'm looking forward to hearing hearing that story as well.
Absolutely. Okay. So over the ages, there have been many tales of encounters with the supernatural. The supernatural denizens of the woodlands of the world. And here we will look at some that take on a rather frightening quality to show that the forest can not only propel wonder on myth, but also fear as well. Some of the most spectacular encounters with strange, unsettling mystical forces in the forest are those accounts that describe seeing some sort of spooky wood spirit or perhaps even demons. Which, for the record, I don't believe in demons. That's a topic of conversation for the next episode, I'm sure.
It's definitely one that we'll have to discuss because personally, I do, but I don't think it's quite what people tend to believe what they are, if that makes sense.
No,
I don't know.
absolutely.
We're definitely on, like, we have a lot of similar views, don't get me wrong, but I do think that is something we do moderately disagree on, but it's nothing like exponentially crazy, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. These are those incidents in which people have come across what seem to be ghostly or magical entities, somehow connected to the forest, and which likely do not mean to be seen at all. From the site Your Ghost Stories, we have an account from a woman who had a bizarre experience as she was hiking in the summertime with her boyfriend in the mountains of Italy. On one of the most peaceful hikes she reached one of the most peaceful hikes she had, she reached the end of the trail before her boyfriend. She decided to wait here and enjoy the tranquil scenery while she waited for him to arrive. She says this of what happened next. I was sitting there on a rock, and I don't know how, but I felt something was in the woods behind me. Behind me there was a precipice, not very deep through the forest, and it would cover the majority of the end of it and all around. I stood up and tried to see if there was something down there. That's when I saw it. I still get shivers when I think about this. Deep down there was a camawa, a beautiful one with long horns. I'm not sure if camawas, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's Chamois. Any ideas?
No, it sounds like you're saying it right. What is that? Is it a type of animal?
I'm not sure, but she goes on to say a beautiful one with long horns. I got excited because I rarely see one. I'm guessing this is some kind of a creature that lives in Italy.
How did you spell it again? I'm sorry.
Chamois. I haven't the slightest idea, but while you look that up,
Yeah, it looks like it's almost like a type of, almost like a goat. Yeah, it's a species that's related to like goats and antelopes. That's native to the mountains in southern Europe,
Interesting.
from the Pyrenees to the Alps and so on.
Okay, yeah, it's probably like pronounced like chamois, and I just called it camawa because that's how my brain instantly read that. Good thing I have narrator brain.
Apparently, the ch I think is actually silent because it says the pronunciation is amwa.
Emwa. Okay, so I wasn't that.
I don't know. I would just go with what your gut tells you, man. I mean, God knows we do our best, but we do not speak. Well, at least I don't speak Italian.
No. I got excited because I rarely see one. I was looking at him from behind. His fur was light brown and he had a black line that went from the neck down to his tail. But something was very wrong with it. That's when I froze. His front legs looked like they didn't end with a normal cloven hoof, but he had 3 fingers at the end of his front leg similar to a bird claw, but not that sharp. The back leg seemed normal. I could see it because he was walking very slowly and calmly through the vegetation. Then I noticed with great horror that his face seemed flat, no muzzle. I couldn't look at him directly in the face, but I could see his forehead and his nose. What should have been there just wasn't. Is this like a griffin type story? Whoa, this is bizarre.
Yeah, that's really weird considering I'm also looking at a picture of an amwa right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very bizarre because they look like fat goats with white. You know, they're mostly black with like some white stripes, and then like the typical horns and what have you with big like pointed up ears.
Yeah.
But to imagine one without hooves just wouldn't really make sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, they would not have a flat face whatsoever. It's very much a, what I mean, that protruding kind of snout type of face, like a goat.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thinking about it now, I really wished I hadn't seen its face, just to see how the eyes and the mouth were organized. He disappeared in the pine's shadow, and I was still there shocked when my boyfriend finally arrived. I told him what I saw and he didn't believe me. He laughed. I know it's not scary and it can be even funny if you think about it. One of these animals with an eagle leg and a flat face. I thought about it all the time we were descending. It was so weird. At the end, I told myself that I must have dreamed it. Even if I would love to know that I wasn't the only one to see that thing. I like to think of it was a deity that took the form of a Kamawa or Amwa. There wasn't any village at the mountain's feet, so I couldn't ask if someone saw that too, or if someone knew anything about this weird animal living in the forest. So what interests me the most about this is throughout my travels through Appalachia specifically, one thing that came up time and time again were the knot deer, which if you guys are not familiar is exactly what it sounds like. And that goes into Cherokee Native American legend and just several Native American legends all spanning across the U.S. here. But another thing that seemed to come up a lot were goats walking on their hind legs, like a human would, basically. And that three-toed footprint seems to come up time and time again, which this creature would have had. And for those who that might sound familiar, if you're familiar with the show Hellier, they were kind of tracking three-toed footprints, but it goes deeper than that. There's a book that's called Where the Footprints End. There's 2 volumes. It is a phenomenal look into Bigfoot lore and research, but they do a deep dive into these three-toed footprints, and these things seem to come up all around high strangeness. There's even several UFO cases like the Flatwoods Monster that locals reported seeing these three-toed footprints in areas they shouldn't be. So not saying the two are connected, but what are your thoughts on that, Cody?
Well, it's kind of hard to keep them organized here. It's definitely weird, again, how everything is interconnected or seems to be interconnected. But I wanted to kind of touch upon how, I don't know how one could think that they simply just imagined it or they were dreaming when they were obviously fully aware and conscious. I do think that's a little bit of a cope, but I know that's where my mind would probably tend to wander, like, oh, I'm just, playing tricks on myself or what have you. But especially being out in the elements and coming across something that you can't really describe. I mean, you would think that they would be more or less familiar with the wildlife in the area, to a certain extent, perhaps not every single animal or, species, but they would be relatively familiar with what is normally out there. So to not recognize that, and then also to essentially be disturbed by what you're seeing, I mean, it's got to, I don't know, it makes me wonder.
See, that's what's always interesting to me, because I'm sure that you've come across this in hauntings as well, where someone says, I can't believe what I'm seeing, or I don't even believe this as I'm recounting the story back.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it becomes so commonplace. Again, we kind of touched on this with Alan, but it makes you wonder as a researcher and as an investigator, is this all by design? Is the phenomena? Again, we're kind of encompassing the all here, and I don't want to go too deep into that conversation, but for sake of the conversation, the all. Is it by design to make us question our sanity to a point that we're like, I don't even know if I want to share this story? Is that its way of being seen without really being seen? And that's a question I have for the listeners as well. Has there ever been a time in your life that you have had something like this happen? Maybe not, as extreme as this, but something happened that you find yourself in the moment, what you just saw, your brain has processed it, but then your next logical step in your brain is, did I even see what I just saw?
Right. It's almost as if we're hardwired to have that kind of a response. You know what I mean? And is that by design as well?
Yeah, which I mean, that leads into conversations like the uncanny valley theory. Like, we have a reason to fear things that look human but aren't. That's an innate fear ingrained in our brains from some primal, pre-evolution.
It's instinctual, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Like what is it? The baby, I'm trying to think of it. It's like the baby birds, fear other predators, it's like that in a sense, instinctual. But yeah, just, man, even the thought of something that appears to be human but is not human, it stirs up something within the human soul that it's almost like a predator. It's trying to blend in. It's like aggressive mimicry. You know what I mean? Where it's trying to blend in amongst us to do God knows what, something nefarious, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it here. But continuing on, this is obviously not some normal animal of the forest. So did she happen to come across some forest spirit or deity as she suspects? Or was this all some strange hallucination? Perhaps an even odder tale comes from a Reddit poster who claims that at the time he'd been in the wilds outside of Houston, Texas, in what he describes as an isolated patch of forest by a creek. He'd set a hammock up that evening and was relaxing, listening to the sounds of the night when the strange came for him. He explains his experience. This night, it was dark, like extra dark. I think the moon was covered up, but there was still enough city light to create a dim atmospheric glow. And I heard some movement, definitely coming my way, where I was on the creek. And it didn't seem as cautious as most of the other animals, which startled me. Whatever was coming my way was ballsy. I don't think I had a knife at the time, so I think I grabbed a stick and listened quietly as the sound got closer. It kept walking in my direction, but I could barely see a thing. Eventually, it got pretty close, and I could faintly see a silhouette. This wasn't an animal I'd seen before. It was a white, with long legs, too tall to be a hog and definitely not a deer. It just stood there staring at me, as if it was pissed that I was in its spot or something. I don't think I made any sudden movements or anything, but just sat there looking, trying to figure out what it was. Eventually, it went back into the forest, and honestly, even with how much I go through these same patches of woods, I haven't seen it again. I was thinking it was a wolf or a coyote, but this thing was white, like white enough to see him in almost pitch black darkness, and he had long legs and a real dignified demeanor, like he just stared at me, not scared at all. I ain't seen nothing like that before, and I ain't seen it since, nor have I seen any footprints or anything that really seemed indicative of what it was. Just long legs, white fur, and a really calm, dignified demeanor. The witness also describes feeling a sense of power and menace from the entity. So what's interesting about this, have you ever heard of the white blob from West Virginia?
I have not, no.
So on my other podcast, Tales from the Dark, we do a series called United Strangeness of America, where we basically dive into state-by-state stories, where we in each episode we'll cover hauntings, cryptids, and then UFO stories from each. And one that always stands out to me is the story of the White Thing of West Virginia. Now, West Virginia, famous for the Mothman, it often gets kind of overshadowed that there's a lot more strange happening in West Virginia than just the Mothman.
Yeah, I would argue, especially having been to Point Pleasant now, that it's a focal point for high strangeness in a sense.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So the White Thing, and I'm going to butcher this, but basically the story, the way I've heard it told, where some hunters saw something just like this, but they described it as massive, like a huge, not quite Sasquatch, but very similar in demeanor of like, these are my woods, I own these woods, you are here as a guest and you shouldn't be type of thing. So the white nature of this, can see it in complete darkness, almost illuminating presence, reminds me a lot of that white, whatever it is in West Virginia. And this story comes from Texas. So again, it kind of begs to maybe speculate that these things are happening all over, but just like the tales of yesteryear, no one's really talking about them for one reason or another.
I mean, I'm sure it's because they don't want to be perceived as crazy,
No, absolutely. And that's something that we've seen time and time again, at least I can say I have for sure. Again, kind of going back to Appalachia here, everyone there seems to have a story of some sort. And what's funny is I kind of always open up with the same thing. Hey, I'm a paranormal investigator. Have you ever seen anything weird around here? No, nothing weird. But I did see a Bigfoot. I saw a couple goblins, 3 or 4 thunderbirds, and a pixie, but nothing weird.
It's not weird for around here.
Yeah, well, but that's the thing. You always going to take a step back of like, oh, well, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Wait, what do you mean it's not weird? But then you have to remind yourself, if they're seeing this stuff from an early age, they grew up in these hills, and this is normal life to them, it's not that surprising that to them, it's like, oh, that's not strange. Strange to them could be, a million other things, but to them, that's just a way of life.
Yeah. I mean, it effectively would be just a part of life at that point.
Yeah. So continuing on here, another odd account comes from a Reddit poster who says that his experience happened in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, which are a rugged portion of the northern Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States. He claims that at the time he worked at the Appalachian Mountain Club at the Visitor Center, and they would often stay there after hours. This was when he would begin to notice something rather odd in the nearby wilderness, and this would escalate into the truly terrifying. He says, "Every once in a while, as I walk from the dorms to the main building, I would see lights up on the mountain, and I usually dismissed it as some hiker or camper, and most other people did as well. It was a very rainy night, so I could have been hearing things or just my own paranoia. But some lights seemed very close, and it bobbed up and down quickly, so I went to go and see if someone needed help. But it quickly went out, and I could see from my own phone light a crouched, very dark humanoid shape. Hunched over, I ran. Yeah, screw that noise."
Yeah, I would be out immediately.
The next day, I asked the dishwasher who I was very close to, and he claimed to have seen something similar, but no one else believed him, as he was pretty new as well. I had about 2 months left on my work contract, so I decided to keep quiet about it. Where I live, it's around an old paper mill, and I had a close friend come up, and we decided to go out for a walk in the woods across the street. It was about midnight, and being college students, we didn't care about sleep at all. The area of the woods we walked in used to be a street in the early 1900s, so there's a lot of road bits, but there's one that's specifically that I have no better way to describe it as unearthly, damn near perfectly circular, and a lack of foliage around it. Again, I have no better way to describe it, other than it called to me. I had a weird possession to sit on this rock. I had my friend watch my back as he had a weird feeling about it as well. About a minute in, I got a splitting headache. As much as I wanted to get off this rock, I couldn't move. I was absorbed in something else. About another minute in, I called out to my friend to see if he saw anything, and he claimed to see a dark, hunched-over humanoid figure in the trees. I had to have him drag me off the rock, and we ran out of the woods terrified. See, that's interesting, because is this a fairy circle you're trapped in? What drew you to this location in the first place, and why couldn't you move?
Well, and the humanoid figure as well. Just, that gives me chills just thinking about.
Yeah, no, same. Okay, so the next encounter here says, let me pull it up. I apologize. There was a new road going through my forest made last year. I walked my dogs there a couple of times, but I never went too far. Until this time, when I went all the way to see the end of the road. There's a dead end after that, nothing but forest. There was also a cliff or a drop-off, so there were no more paths that I or anyone else could walk. I sat there on the forest floor and was giving my dogs water when I heard someone calling me. He or she, I couldn't quite recognize if it was a male or female, were shouting my name. I wasn't quite sure if I heard it right, so I stood still and waited to hear if they said it again. And they did. They repeated it a few times, and now I was 100% sure they were calling my name. I thought it was maybe someone who I know, so I shouted back. No response. They just continued shouting my name over and over again. I eventually got up and returned home. I could still hear my name shouted as I was walking away. I don't know what that was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I don't know if it was a person. I don't know what they were. Because as I already said, there was a cliff at the end of the road, not a place where people could walk, and the shouts were coming from that direction, from the forest, like someone was at the bottom of the cliff. I went down that road a couple more times after that, and nothing weird happened. I always felt kind of uneasy there, since that part of the forest is a bit dark, so I watched at all times, especially now that that happened. It's like I expect someone is out there just waiting on me. What do you make of that, Cody?
Well, that's terrifying in many ways. Isn't that, and not only attributable perhaps to the Fae folklore, but also kind of ties into local Appalachian folklore where you're not supposed to respond to things that call your name in the woods?
Yeah, now one day we will do a deep dive on why people should not listen to the TikTok nonsense about Appalachia, because 99% of what's on there is just all crap.
Yeah, it's just people trying to, I don't know, get views would be my best guess.
Yeah, I call it fear baiting because that's exactly what it is. There's a gentleman on TikTok called the Twilight Emporium. I would highly recommend you guys go check out his content because I want to say he lives in Kentucky or Tennessee, and 95% of his content is just centered around Appalachia in general and kind of debunking the myths around Appalachia. But one thing that I heard a lot growing up, because my family's from Appalachia, is if you hear whistling, don't whistle back. But also, if you hear your name in the forest, no, you didn't. And so I dove into that a little while ago, And I found that going back, 50, 60 years, actually further back to the Confederacy, there were soldiers who would report hearing like a baby crying on the battlefield. And the baby would be crying like in the way of the incoming marching army. And this is on both sides that reported hearing things like this. And of course, this would kind of do a deep dive into this. And you hear about that in paranormal cases all the time, about these babies crying in the woods. And then more as of, let's say, in the mid-90s to now, it's kind of evolved into hearing your own name being shouted in the woods. And I've probably read a dozen hiker stories about hearing your own name on the Appalachian Trail. Specifically being like, hey, I'm 20 miles from the nearest town. The Appalachian Trail is huge. It's a crazy expansive. It's like one of the things you do as a hiker is like the look how tough I am as a hiker type of deal.
I mean, it's ginormous, and it's older than bone.
Yes, that's the one big thing about Appalachia is it is in fact older than bone.
Ancient.
So to me, it's kind of freaky because I can't imagine what we would do if we were out investigating something and suddenly we heard our own name. Like that would terrify me.
Oh yeah, dude. 100%. But knowing you would think one of us was messing with you, and you would probably try and spend God knows how much time debunking it, which is, what you should do. Don't get me wrong. But it would be unnerving, to say the least, for any of us, let alone, yourself.
No, absolutely. All right, so I've got one more here that I'm going to throw it over to you.
Sure thing. I did want to chime in real quick again. I would love to get into some Civil War era paranormal type content in the future for sure, because that stuff fascinates the hell out of me.
Oh, dude, absolutely. So this one goes on. One more account that seems related was given by a witness in England who had a couple of weird encounters with a forest spirit of some sort. It started when he went out for a walk in the forest near his house one day and ended up in a clearing, where he explains what happened next here. It was night when I arrived first, and I had to make use of a torch to get to the bottom of the hill, which looked out across the wide field. I laminated after a while, speaking my troubles into the wind, which blew back comforts at the end of my sentences. I can always tell when someone is from England writing like an encounter because they still somehow make it poetic.
Yeah.
It was then that I noticed something across the field, a small pinpoint light appearing for a moment before vanishing into the darkness once again. At first, I was about to leave, startled by someone obviously walking towards me with their phone out as a torch. But torches aren't that small, or perfectly round, orb-like, nor do they dance up into the air and fade out into existence. And no one would ever in a million years be able to walk through the slick muck without the aid of a light. So turning it off and on again in a single moment would be pointless and ultimately fruitless. I stayed for a while afterwards, thinking I saw it again, but couldn't be too sure if it wasn't just my eyes playing tricks on me. The next time I went out there was Christmas Eve. I once again sat there, this time in the forest itself, talking to a seemingly nothing, but something. I ended a sentence with a greeting saying hello to whatever white light lived thereabouts. I was hailed by a guttural greeting back, short and clipped, rough but gurgled, like a wet rock going down a stream. No one was there. I was at the center, and the looseness of the trees let me see completely 360 degrees. And as a result, I was thoroughly freaked out enough to leave with the promise to never come back again. So that's one of those encounters that I almost struggle to say it's Fae, because there's a lot of misidentification that happens with the Fae folk, but the lights do kind of remind me of the fairy lights of Suffolk, which you see a lot and hear a lot of those stories, and the ones that are over in Scotland, which I know you guys just got back from.
Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to put it, we did potentially have some kind of an encounter with the Fae, or rather Meg did, but did not involve any sort of lights or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure you're very aware with the whole night terror situation that went down. That was really weird, to say the least, and I'm sure that we could delve into that another time. But yeah, it's very much, I mean, being out in Scotland and being, just in Europe in general, out in the woods, it's easy to see how there could be something mystical or mythical living out there, because it very much has a different feel. It's so much older. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I know you've got some stories prepared for us. why don't you take the lead here and take us on a good little ride here, Cody?
Well, I will certainly do my best here. The first one I have, and I wanted to tell this before I got into my own encounter because I found this one rather fascinating when I was researching some stories earlier. It's a dogman encounter that happened actually not too far from my neck of the woods out in Jackson County, Kansas. And it looks like this story was originally submitted. The person who submitted it wanted to remain anonymous, and looks like it was submitted back in 2015. Since it was summer break from my school, I was lazily lounging at home watching TV. I got bored, so I went outside to see if I could do anything with my chickens, like feed them worms and snails. Because, of course, in Kansas, we have to have chickens.
And fields. That's about
And
all you guys
fields.
have out there.
Yeah, so true. Before I go into more detail, I should explain the area I live in. My home is on the outskirts of the city I live in. Okay, that makes more sense. I had about 5 or 7 chickens at the time, and we didn't have an expanded coop. So it was a small pen connecting the 2 sides of the chicken coop, which is wooden and sturdy. The only ways to get into the coop is either through the trap door attached to the big door and the 3 windows. Oh, and my apologies. And the 3 windows. One window is on one side of the door, and the second window is on the other side. The third window is a large window. Keep in mind that they all have traps connected to them, so they could be closed. We have 7 acres of woodland that we call the back pasture. And if you've ever seen back there, you could see that it's a popular habitat for the local deer. There was also a wild boar that was roaming around at the time, and I didn't know how it got there. Which, I mean, this is kind of irrelevant, but I've seen that wild boars actually have become more of a problem in Kansas and Oklahoma, particularly since that time.
Man, boars in general have become a massive problem. People have no idea how fast that they breed and how mean a wild boar can actually be.
Dude, they breed so fast, and they get huge. Some of them, they get beefy. But yeah, it's definitely a problem and a topic for another day. But anywho, we had been having trouble with poachers for a while, considering the population of deer in the woods. One poacher had set up a trail cam, one that was motion activated, and there was an old rusty deer stand that had been put on a tree a long time ago, and the tree had begun to grow around it. Beyond our acres of woods, there's a large cornfield owned by our neighbors, and beyond that is forest. I don't know what the forest is like beyond the field since we've never been there. I went outside to do something with my chickens, and I had brought along a bucket of corn for feeding the deer after. When I walked out of my home, I saw a doe that was sitting in the tall grass. I thought it was sleeping since it had its head down and it wasn't moving. I, being the curious little nut that I was, decided that I would sneak up on the deer and get a picture of it to show my mother when she got home from work. I crept as silently as I could through the yard that separated me from the deer. I should also mention that we have a clearing with a burn pit and that it was filled with cedar branches. I was creeping across my yard towards the deer when I cleared the burn pit, and it was about 10 yards from it. And realized that the deer wasn't asleep, but it was dead. It was the most disgusting sight that I had ever seen. Its intestines were completely gone, the flesh on the body of the doe shredded to pieces, and blood absolutely everywhere. It looked as if it had been sitting there for a while, and it smelled like it too. Most of the blood was dried, and the air reeked with the stench of rotting flesh, urine, and what seemed like a hint of wet dog. Something that creeped me out about the scene was, although it was a rotting carcass, there was no insects around it at all. It was as if the usual lively forest was deader than the deer. Not even the neighbor's cattle made a sound. It looked as if the poor deer had simply been left after being brutally attacked and half-eaten, which it most likely was. I left the bucket at the beginning of the trail, thinking that I would come out later with my mother and grain the deer when she got home. Then I started to walk back to my house. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard a low, snarling growl that sounded like a wolf. although it seemed distorted, as if it were being played on an old radio. That's the only way I could think of describing it. Against my better judgment, I turned my head around, and I saw what looked like the biggest freaking wolf I had ever seen. It was on all fours. Its fur was black and matted. Its face was what you'd expect a wolf to look like, although it was broad and the muzzle seemed a little short. Although the way it was curling its lips made it look as if its snout was plenty long and its eyes were yellow. Not a bright yellow, like the yellow of a flower or the sun, but a dim, amber, reddish yellow, if that makes sense. Its ears looked like that of a Doberman Pinscher, with the cropped effect. Its front legs were long, and it looked as if it were a bodybuilder. Its paws, if you could even call them that, looked like huge hands with long claws at the end of them. It stood up, and I heard the most sickening popping sound you could ever imagine. It sounded like the sound of popping joints, but it seemed amplified, as if it were being played through a microphone, and the sound was coming out of loudspeakers. Its body looked like a bodybuilder's pumped up on steroids because it was so big. It had no tail that I could tell, and it seemed to tower over me, although I was a good 10 meters from it. I was about 5'4" at the time, my apologies, and I came nowhere close to its height. It was so tall that the tip of its ears could almost touch the top of a young cedar. It let out a loud howl, which sounded more like a roar, and it charged at me. Doing the only thing I knew to do, while hyped up on fear and adrenaline, I began to run away from it. I remember clearing my yard in what seemed like hours, but it was more than likely just a few seconds. After running inside, slamming and locking all the doors and windows, as I calmed down a bit, I had realized that if it had wanted to kill me, that it could have. That what I had experienced was not an attack, but a bluff. I was lucky to get away with my life. Although this happened almost 2 years ago, it still terrifies me to think about it. The deer was gone the next day, and ever since that evening, I have been weary around the woods, only going in them in broad daylight, only when I absolutely had to, and never without a weapon. Sadly, I cannot say that I am one of those people that have stopped experiencing things after the encounter, although I only had nightmares for a month after that day in June. Nothing really started to happen again until about 2 months ago, when I was staying up at night playing on my laptop. I had started to hear things moving around on the porch and turned on the porch light to see a shape of something huge disappearing behind the corner of my house. There was also one of the rare times I went into the woods after the first encounter when I was helping my mother clear brush from hunting clearing. I was going to get the mower and was walking the trail to do so when I heard bipedal steps following me off to my side. They stopped whenever I stopped, and I eventually ran out of the woods, and I haven't been back since. I asked my late grandmother about the creature I'd seen in the woods, and she informed me that there was something called the wolf-head man that had stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children that strayed too far from their teepees. Later, I was informed by my history teacher that my house had actually been built on a tribal burial ground, and I have since been wondering if that had something to do with it. I hadn't heard about the wolf-head man before she had told me about it. When I saw that there were several eyewitness reports that were proved to be truthful, it made me feel a lot better about coming out with this information. I had attempted to tell people previously, but everyone either said I was stupid or crazy, or just a plain liar. They then go on to thank the site that they submitted it to, but man, what do you make of that, Bob?
Well, first off, I have to point out, I find it hilarious we both accidentally slip into our narrator voices when we're reading someone else's work.
Oh, dude, always. It's just, it's a default.
Yeah, and again, like, it's so funny because, like, I never hear you do this in real life, and so it's one of those, like, oh, I get, like, my own little campfire experience with Cody. I love this.
It's funny because I think the same thing about you, but I just didn't say anything.
Yeah. Like I said, and like, again, we kind of talked about, pulling the curtain up a little bit for the audience. And this is a big thing for YouTube narration in general. Like there's an entire different headspace you get in when you're reading things. And then there's times where I find myself like when I'm reading a book, I'll read it in my narration voice.
Oh, 100%. I do the same thing.
Yeah, but back to the story here a little bit. There's a handful of things that are interesting, and I want to hit on one in particular. Are you familiar at all with the hitchhiker effect? Have you heard that term at all?
I can't say that I have off the top of my head. No.
So this is something very interesting that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp discussed on their podcast, Weaponized, not too long ago. Where what George Knapp noticed during his time both at Skinwalker Ranch and then post Skinwalker Ranch is that people would go to the ranch, usually skeptics, saying, "Oh, this is all nonsense. I'm coming here to prove it wrong." They'll have some sort of kind of even a fringe encounter, nothing insane, no full body apparition, no seeing these beings or these entities that allegedly haunt the ranch. Which I have my own Skinwalker Ranch story from a few years ago. I'll share one day.
Definitely.
But what's really intriguing, at least to me, is when you see these things, they have encounters with the paranormal for months or even years or even the rest of their lives after visiting Skinwalker Ranch. And
that's fascinating. And that makes you think as well, as far as like, the whole hitchhiker concept that you could potentially pick up or have, a more of a propensity to see things after you visited and had an experience at a place, like Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it always intrigues me though, because one thing I noticed during the Ammons haunting, specifically the one that happened in Indiana, was it a house of 1,000 demons or something? I don't remember the
I think it was the house of over 200 demons or something like that. It was touted as so, even though there was never really any sort of a numerical amount that was even given, let alone proven. But it is a fascinating case and one that I've delved into a couple times now, actually.
Yeah, I think I was confusing that for House of 1,000 Corpses.
Oh, you're good, man. That terrified me as a child.
Yes, one day I want to do like a full, maybe whenever we set up a Patreon, we'll do like our favorite horror movies. But
I'm so down for that.
Yeah, but back to the hitchhiker effect a bit here. What I've always found intriguing is when you see these sightings come up time and time again, especially with a skeptical crowd. Because again, I don't instantly believe everything that I see. Members of my audience prior know that I'm kind of the guy you send things to be debunked. And again, that comes from a video editing background. And same with you. You do this stuff long enough, you can kind of start to pick out the fakes from the good stuff. And like Alan said, if it looks too good to be a ghost, it probably is not a ghost.
Right. And I very much agree with that. It's, and this is something my audience, some of them may or may not be familiar with, but, I don't believe every single case that I cover, because having done this for, a good while now, is, not necessarily out in the field for more than, I don't know, going on like a year or so now for that, but actually delving into the cases, just independently and researching them and then making content, etc. You can kind of see where things are getting mixed up and or blown out of proportion, or people are just outright making things up sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, the sensationalism.
I'm all for a fantastic story, don't get me wrong, but yeah, sometimes the sensationalism does get out of hand.
Yeah, but kind of back to the question of what I think about the story. I just find that very interesting that he continued, or I'm assuming it was he continued to have these paranormal encounters after the fact. Because again, that's a byproduct of high strangeness. And I'm constantly reminded there's that phrase of, gaze long enough into the abyss. Don't be surprised when the abyss gazes back. I don't know who made that quote originally. I've heard it credited to like 15 different authors, but
I'm not going to lie, but it's a good one. It's a good one.
Yeah, but it's definitely the truth. And people often ask, why do paranormal investigators have so many paranormal encounters? Well, it's the easy answer, the obvious one, is because you're looking for it. If you are a plumber and you're looking for a leak and all you do all day is look for leaks, you shouldn't be surprised when you're able to identify them and see them before other people can. It's kind of this, the same way when it comes to paranormal investigators. But what I love about this story the most is there's just enough detail that you can feel the fear. But then there's also that thing that most men do where they're kind of hamming it up. Like, I was terrified, but I wasn't that scared.
Right. I think it was told from If I'm not mistaken, it seems like it was probably told because I'm not so sure they mentioned their age now that I'm looking back at it.
Mhm.
If I were to guess, probably early teens, early to mid teens, maybe like 15, 16. Just throwing it out there. And it's one of those things where like as a growing, teenage boy or, what have you, you want to seem like you're brave,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
at the end of the
absolutely.
day, you're probably absolutely terrified
Yeah. So
if you encountered something like that.
oh yeah, 100%. Okay. So I've got one more encounter here that I want to go over that I want to hear your dog man encounter.
Sure. I will forewarn everyone. I can't remember every single little detail about it, but I'd be happy to give what I can recall.
So this next report comes from October of 1995, when a witness only known as Tango was out camping with his family and his dog in the White Mountains of Arizona. At the time, darkness was coming, the day coming to an end and the sun getting real low. And yet they had not managed to find a camping spot for the night as they drove along an isolated narrow dirt road. As the dark began to cling to them, and the trees seemed to extend their branches outwards in the growing shadows as they retreated into gray, amorphous shapes. I can talk, I promise. Tango's father stopped to turn around the car and head back, hoping they could find a place somewhere along the route they had come through. That dim road ahead, a little too mysterious and uninviting. As they bumped along the steadily darkening road, there then appeared a little girl, somehow out there in the middle of nowhere, dressed in tattered clothes and obviously very frightened of something. When the father stopped to ask if she was okay, the mysterious girl simply blurted out, "You shouldn't be here. Please go back." They tried to soothe her, but the girl just kept repeating that same line before running off into the brush before they could stop her, and their calls to her went unanswered. Truly unsettled by now, the family continued on. I love that they just left.
I mean, I'm unsettled right now just hearing it.
Yeah, just left. That is the most realistic part of any encounter I've ever heard in my life. Like, no, I saw a little girl in the woods. She ran away and I dipped out.
Yeah, and I dipped. I mean, to be fair, I feel like if we encountered something like that, just out in the field, out of the blue, you know what I mean? Just not anticipating anything. I feel like we would probably follow it into the woods. Not gonna lie.
So
they might get us.
So truly unsettled by now, the family continued on. That strange girl and her ominous words weighing heavily on their minds. They eventually did find a camping site. I love that they still went camping. They didn't go back.
Damn it, I'm not going to let some weird ass kid ruin my family's nice time.
That is amazing. Okay. I believe the 90s were a crazy time. I fully believe this happened.
I'm not going to lie. Yeah, dude, the 90s were something. The 90s were pretty good from what I remember.
Yeah. They eventually did find a camping site and set up their tents in silence, wondering perhaps if that little girl was still out there. Maybe even watching them from the growing shadows. What are they talking about? Go home.
Dude, yeah, why did you still go camping?
They started up a campfire, and as they finally settled down after a long day on the road, they were all simultaneously hit with a distinct, intensely creepy feeling that they were being watched. This was followed by a primordial screech from out in the black night.
Oh, hell no.
Yeah, and then there was a thing that leaped out of the trees and into the light of the fire. The witness would say of this: it had sharp teeth and no fur. It was the size of a bear, but its eyes were yellow. I was frozen in fear. It stood for 10 seconds in the light, then galloped off into the forest. I was horrified. My dog was whimpering, and it curled its tail between its legs. This was the most horrifying experience of my life. The creature was extremely skinny, and it looked like flesh and bones. The disturbing image of this thing is implanted in my mind forever. That sounds like a Wendigo, 100%.
Yeah. The size of a bear, the yellow eyes, all of it.
Yeah, skin and bones. Okay, for the listeners.
The thought of something is skin and bones, bro. Coming for you, and the screech, no thank you.
Yeah, again, here's just for all of our listeners, we're just going to put this out there. If you're going camping and you see a small child, go and call the police.
Oh, 1,000%.
Yeah, don't proceed to still set up your $15 Ozark tent from Walmart that you're going to return the next day. Just go back to town because you're going to die. Definitively, that's what's going to happen. And again, I can tell that this was set in the 90s, because back then, this is right before Blair Witch. So right before Blair Witch, no one had a fear of the woods. Blair Witch came out. I guarantee if Google Trends was around, we would see
it would have popped off.
Yeah, we'd see a stark decline of camping and outdoor accessories for the following year after the Blair Witch Project came out, which I don't know if you know this, Cody, but people, the way that it was initially advertised was it
was real.
Mm-hmm. There was a website set up to find the missing kids that were shooting this film. Everyone thought it was real. And, I think for our time frame, the closest that we got to this was like Paranormal Activity, where they kind of framed the first one as a real found footage, like ghost.
Yeah, like a real found footage for sure before it, franchise devolved and all of that, and vice versa with the Blair Witch as well. But man, I wonder if the author of the Blair Witch, which I don't know who it is off the top of my head, or, multiple people, I wonder if they just really got tired of having to like deal with other people when they were camping. So they're like, let me just make something really fucking scary that's just going to keep people out of the woods.
Yeah. Well, what's really wild is I did a deep dive in college into the Blair Witch. And I think I either did a video or a podcast on the Blair Witch at some point. And there were like death threats written to the studio because of it, because people were out looking for these kids. And again,
bro,
we were a lot more gullible back in the day. Before,
absolutely.
Yeah. Like before we could just get on Google and be like, hey, is the Blair Witch real? People thought it was real. And then there was this hound of tourism to that town. And this is something Matthew Bird, a good friend of mine and friend of the show, has brought to me before. People destroyed the woods of that town because they thought it was a real thing. And they were trying to find the house in the middle of the whole nine. So,
I mean, God tier marketing, don't get me wrong. And I'm sure it paid off for the studio, but oof. You might want to be like, hey guys, it was fun for a little bit, but you guys are spurging out.
Yeah. Well, my thing is at what point, how many death threats does it take to at that point say it's all a hoax? Like, is 3 the magic number?
Yeah, I feel like more than 2 would probably do it for the average, studio or person in general.
I think as a creator, like you're not really a creator till you get your first death threat. That's when you're like, okay, I've made it.
It's funny you say that because I don't do very good with vague threats. That's not my favorite thing to encounter. And boy, have I had a lot of them the last 4 years. I've had a lot, dude.
There are few things that people are as passionate about. And it kind of goes back to the ties with spiritualism and nature when it comes to the paranormal. Because again, people, this is very much like a lot of people's religion that we're kind of messing with. And when you're discussing life after death, this is something that I'll get into whenever I talk about my problem with ghost hunting and paranormal tourism in general.
I'd get back into that for sure.
Yeah, but when you're deep diving into these aspects, it's like you are kind of playing with someone's almost like their religion. Like when you're pulling the wool over their eyes for life after death of all things, people get a little upset with you.
Yeah, they do.
Okay, so I know we're coming up at the end of our time here, but what is your dogman encounter, Cody?
Okay, so, well, from what I can't remember, again, a ton of specifics because it did happen a long time ago, but I would say this was probably roughly 2005, 2006 or so. I was living in what I would consider to be the second haunted home that I grew up in. A lot of my listeners will be familiar with, kind of my backstory with how I came up, and I've got a whole video on it. If you ever want to do a deep dive, I go far into it on my channel there on Mystery Archives. But same exact home, same time frame. And actually basically I had a friend named Colby, and he was a little bit younger than I was. He lived 2 houses down from us. And he was in my sister's class, actually, school class. Because, then we're in Sedgwick, so there's not a lot of people. I think back then, there was maybe like 1,600 people that lived in the town. It's kind of a small place where everybody knows everybody. But it's also one of those places I described, similar to Point Pleasant, where it seems to be a focal point for high strangeness, or a place where the veil seems to be a little thinner. Anyways, Sedgwick seems to be one of those weird liminal places. And there was one evening, Colby had been over at my house, and it was dark out. I remember For some reason or another, I had to walk him home or something. I don't know if he was scared or what, because again, he was a little younger than I was, and I was only maybe 9 or 10 at the time, give or take. And anyways, long story short, we get outside, and where we lived there was a rock quarry basically across the street and a little a ways back from our house, and then all of it was surrounded by woodlands. And we would go out there, fairly often. We used to get in trouble actually for climbing the gravel pits in the rock quarry, but again, a story for another day. But from what I can remember, we had gone outside, and I remember we were just kind of, joking around, shooting the shit about something. And I was going to walk him down to his house, and that was going to be it. I was going to walk back home, and that was going to be the end of the night. Well, off to the left, where there's basically one street light on the whole street itself. And the one street light is right over by the entrance to this quarry. And basically, one of the entrances to the woods. Well, we saw something out of the corner of our eyes, and we weren't sure what it was at the time. But it started approaching us fairly quickly, like it was something that was emerging from the wooded area itself. And we were like, what is that? And it came up so fast. And from what I can remember, because a lot of it is a blur now, I wanted to get it out there to the world before I completely forgot about it forever. But long story short, it looked to be some kind of a wolf-like creature, but it was very much large, like a man-sized. And I remember we lost our shit, for lack of better terminology. And I remember we ran to Colby's house because we were terrified, and we went in his garage because his front door was locked. I think his parents, I don't know if they were at work or what was going on. So we had to go back in through his garage to be able to get into his house. I think that was like the system they had set up or what have you. And I remember Colby was so scared that he pissed his pants. And then his mom actually didn't really like me. And I remember her getting home. I just stayed there with him because I was like, I'm not going back out there right now. Like, fuck that. And his mom didn't care for me, but she was like, well, it's my son's friend, whatever. She still let me stay the night because we were like, nah, dude, I'm way too scared to go back out there after we had explained everything to her. And of course, she didn't believe us, but she did let me stay. And then the following morning, I left. Sorry, the details are a little rushed. They're pretty hazy at best. But, it's funny. I had just reconnected with Colby not too long ago. And it was in relation to, he saw his girlfriend or his fiance actually saw my content on YouTube. And he was like, why does that voice sound familiar? And then he searched me up on Facebook, because we've had each other on Facebook for a long time, but like I haven't seen him in a decade plus, and he was like, I'll be damned. So we actually caught up a little bit. I wonder if I'll have to pick his brain a little bit about that encounter and see if he remembers things that I don't, because a lot of shit went down for me around that time. So a lot of my details and memories are kind of hazy because, trauma and just a whole bunch of other shit that popped off around that particular section of my life. But yeah, from what I can recall, it very much was a large wolf-like creature. And the biggest thing we would have had around there, other than a dog, which I was familiar with all of the dogs where we lived, neighbors' dogs and those types of things, who wouldn't have been aggressive like that, for one. But two, would have been like coyotes. And I'm very much familiar with coyotes as well. They're not large walking bipedal type creatures. Even if they stood up on their hind legs, they're not going to be twice the size of me. And I was a huge kid, like at that time, I think I was at least already like probably like 5'5", 5'6". You know what I mean? Like I was always like the tallest in my class. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that sort of a thing. And I just remember us being terrified. I remember us freaking out and running the two houses down to Colby's. I remember we rushed into the garage, and we'd forgot to shut the door behind us. So I had ran back. I slammed the door. I was like trying to figure out how to lock it. Colby's trying to get in the house, and like he legitimately was so scared he pissed his pants. So it's just, yeah, it was just a very weird experience, I guess would be the best way to put it.
No, I can't say I blame him. So it's kind of funny and it's synchronistic in a way, because I think on our first episode we discussed, I think we started talking about doing a podcast together back in Nashville when we did the Tennessee Haunts and Legends Expo together.
Yeah, dude, I think we did. And what's funny is that as you said that, not even realizing that you were going to say that, I'm actually looking at the little lanyard that I have from that.
Yeah, I've got mine literally directly in front of me right now.
I do too. That's crazy.
Yeah. So, but the reason I bring that up is, so I was a keynote speaker at the Haunts and Legends Expo. We showed my documentary, and then we left and we were heading back to Missouri. And I remember we left before everyone else did, and because I was just exhausted, and I'm like, I don't want to drive back to Missouri tonight, but like I'm not getting a hotel. I'm just going to drive back, whatever. And I remember we got an energy drink of some sort, and I was feeling pretty energetic. And we hit the Kentucky by lane there, right around Land Between the Lakes. And I remember freaking out because I was listening to some high strangeness related podcast. Again, 'cause I was feeling it. The energy was there at the Haunts and Legends Expo. I was feeling good. Just met you. Good things were on the horizon. And I saw what I can only describe as it looked like a giant wolf rushed and like literally in front of a semi truck, which is in the right lane next to me that I was passing, and in front of my car, hopped the median down into this like small embankment that went down to the water. Now,
Holy shit.
I look up and see the sign Land Between the Lakes. I'm like, okay, when I get home, I'm going to look up Land Between the Lakes and see if there's any dogman encounters. Of course, I was thrilled to see dozens, if not hundreds, of dogman encounters, and a dogman allegedly haunts the Land Between the Lakes. So
yeah, when I think of Dogman encounters, my mind always gravitates towards the Land of Lakes.
yeah. Now, what's interesting is I, of course, went to I'm just tired. I'm just seeing things, but
of course.
But there was something, in the back of my mind, like I know what I just saw. Like definitively, I saw something that I can't explain. So my brain is instantly going into protect yourself mode, which we kind of discussed at the top of the show here.
Yeah, like fight or flight, essentially.
Yeah. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about real quick is you kind of mentioned the Strawberry Cave. Now, a few years ago, Matthew Bird, who I referenced earlier, he had reached out because he had his son in town. He's like, he wanted to go see some caves or something. So I'm like, okay, well, I was in Ohio at the time. I was like, well, I'm going to drive down to Somerset. Somerset's not too far from you. We went down to Strawberry Cave and we got into the cave. And that's when I found a bear in a cave.
Oh, yeah. I remember you telling me about this. So scary, dude.
Absolutely terrified. Now, granted, I've been back to that cave a dozen times. Haven't seen a bear since, but I talked about how I almost burned those woods down once.
Yeah, you did mention that.
Now, there have been a few other friends of mine that do other paranormal podcasts who have been in the area. Somerset, Kentucky is known for a lot. If you guys want to a deep dive into Somerset, Kentucky specifically, I highly recommend the Penny Royal podcast. Nathan Isaac, Kyle Cadell put that on. It's a phenomenal show and a deep dive into the entire Penny Royal Plateau and what I would consider a modern bluegrass conspiracy for those who are familiar with kind of old school conspiracies, especially in the South. But
yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, but so in those woods, I have often felt very much like I'm being watched. But it's always been like I've never felt bad in those woods before until the night that we went out there. But the time that I almost burned them down, I had bought fireworks, and this was probably July in Appalachia, no rain, and Matthew Bird had messaged me. He's like, hey man, don't let those fireworks off out in the woods. So of course I didn't listen.
You were like, what's that? Light the fireworks off out in the woods? The time is now.
Well, I was doing an offering for the Fae. So I'm like, I'm going to be loud. It's going to be a party. Cause if we go back to Fae culture, that was their thing. They don't like to be snuck up on. So I'm like, what better way to not sneak up on them than literal explosives?
Right. Literally let me detonate my arrival.
Yeah, so long story short, I let this bottle rocket off. It goes up, falls in the woods, catches a pile of leaves on fire. I put it out, thankfully. Now, we had a similar thing that happened that night when we were out there where we kind of got ran off by something in the woods. Now, this particular cave has stories of, I believe they found a dead body in there at one point. There is supposedly
did they
a mythical
really?
beast. Yeah.
In Strawberry Cave?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, dude. I
Um,
did not know that, and I've been there multiple times.
yeah, I
That
try and keep certain details away from you guys, or else you won't visit these places with me.
Oh my god. No, this takes me back to the first time we stayed the night at your house, dude, and you put us in the ritual room as
Yeah,
guinea
well, look,
pigs.
things happen.
You're not wrong.
But kind of going back to what Cody was saying, we found ourselves in Somerset just about a month ago at this point. I think it might actually be a month to the day. Oddly enough, if not, it's pretty close.
You know, I could try and figure here while you delve into it. I'll look back in my photos and see if it tells me the day.
Okay, yeah. So we go out we're looking for a cave to do some activities in. For I don't want to go too deep into that. That'll be another episode.
For sure.
When we arrived, now Strawberry Road, it's a very windy, curvy road. It's a one lane. So if a car's coming, you better hope you can get over. If not, you're both basically stuck. And
Dude, that is actually bizarre. Again, not to interrupt you here, but I just found our photos, and it is exactly 1 month to the day.
yeah, see, these little synchronicities, man, they start to pile up.
Nuts, dude. But now that I think about it, I'm like, we did drive down Christmas evening, so this all makes sense. And then encountered the weird fog and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So we get out of the vehicle and we're kind of prepping to. Are we going to go in this cave, or is it, we had considered another cave? We weren't really certain. When, like Cody mentioned, the entire woods just goes eerily dead silent. And now the hunters out there know when the woods go silent, that's always a telltale sign of there's a predator nearby. And now when I say predator, I could mean a bear, a mountain lion. I'm not saying strictly high strangeness related predator.
Right. But it very well could also be that as well,
Yeah.
but it could be any major large predator.
Yeah, and growing up in the woods, I was always told, when the woods go quiet, you need to stay still, listen, or get out if you can, unless you're hunting. And what surprised me about this location, again, there's a lot of high strangeness related stuff, fairy stories, UFO stories on this road. There's a Men in Black story on this road. UFOs have been spotted in the field right across from the cave. Inside the cave, people have heard chanting, and they've heard
I heard the chanting. Now, I did want to interrupt you there again. I had no idea about the other details. No wonder you don't tell us things. But now that we have been there, you should at another time we should go into that, because I do want to know the details of half of the shit that you just said. But I heard the chanting when we were in there the first time. This was during the day.
Yeah.
Remember when it was me, you, and Meg, we went far back, and Meg kept wanting to go further back, and I was getting creeped out because I was hearing people talking in the back and chanting.
Now, kind of got goosebumps talking about this. What's interesting about this cave specifically, and again, this is where I highly recommend folks go and listen to the Pennyroyal podcast to get the full deep dive of why this cave is so interesting. I believe it was 2 years ago, I received a map to the cave systems in which we are exploring progressively in Somerset. They're all mostly interconnected, which is very interesting.
Incredibly interesting, for sure.
Yeah, but beyond the point where you would have heard the murmuring and the chanting, it's a straight drop almost. So there's nothing on the other side of this hill that could explain what you're hearing, except for maybe a waterfall. But you kind of can tell the difference.
A waterfall is kind of like white noise.
Yeah, you can tell the difference between chanting and humming and a waterfall.
Yeah.
But
Is it the same waterfall that I'm thinking of that I took pictures of?
No. So this is even further back. We've never gone above, over the hill to get down this deep into the.
Okay. I got you. But still, even then, I mean, yeah, I highly doubt that.
Yeah, but kind of tying back into the theme of the episode here with forests. We started hearing weird noises after the whole forest goes dark. Now, it's literally a mountain. It's the cave mouth opening, and then above it's just this massive, dense forest that goes on for probably half a mile, if not longer. Now, we start to hear and see things kind of, and it's one of those, like one of the stories we heard here, or we discussed earlier, where you're not sure if you're really seeing these things in the dark or if they, you don't really know. You can't really tell. And
it's adrenaline or... Yeah, or if you're coping with it, it's hard telling.
Yeah, so in my brain, I'm like, maybe we're just all seeing things. It's late, we're tired, we're out here. You weren't feeling good at all.
Oh, dude, I was sick as hell.
Yeah, but then we started hearing the chanting or the murmuring noises, and it's like, well, what is that? What is happening?
You and I were like frozen listening to that because it sounded like it was sweeping through the trees. And it like moved from the far end of the trees over to where we were, and it almost encircled us where we were at, and I was like, "Oh, dude, we need to get the fuck out of here."
Yeah. But with that being said, I want to thank each and every one of you guys for listening. Thank you guys so much for the support on the first episode. It's amazing to see that you guys are enjoying the content. If you want us to do more stories like this, it can be, cave horror stories or anything. Make sure you let us know. I know Cody's working on a Facebook group. I'm hoping by the time that this goes up, we should have the details of the Facebook group and the page in the description here of the episode. Check us out on YouTube, every major platform we're on. If you guys did enjoy the episode, please leave us a 5-star review. If you're ever on Apple, write us a little message. We love to read the messages. The number one way to help support a brand new podcast like this one is to show it to your friends and to leave us a good review.
100%, guys. And I did want to mention the Facebook page is up. I am working on a group, and the support has been amazing. Yeah, I know that it took us a while to get it started, but now that we have everything rolling, I'm even more excited to be cranking out episodes for you guys. Thank you guys as always, and we appreciate you tuning in.